How did the Mongols survive the coldest winters without freezing? When people imagine the armies of the Genghis Khan, they often picture unstoppable horsemen riding across vast plains, conquering kingdoms, and building the largest land empire the world has ever seen. But there's something even more incredible about the Mongols that most people don't think about. They lived in one of the harshest climates on Earth. The Mongolian steppe is a place of extremes. Summers can be brutally hot, but winters are something else entirely. Temperatures can plunge far below freezing, sometimes reaching minus 40 degrees. Winds sweep across the open grasslands with nothing to stop them. To many outsiders, it seems impossible that people could survive there for long. Yet for centuries, the Mongols not only survived these winters, they thrived. Entire communities lived, traveled, hunted, raised animals, and even launched military campaigns in conditions that would freeze most people within hours. So how did they do it? How did the Mongols survive the coldest winters without freezing? The answer lies in a fascinating combination of clever engineering, deep knowledge of nature, practical clothing, smart diet choices, and a lifestyle perfectly adapted to the environment. Their survival wasn't based on one trick. It was an entire system of living, and every part of Mongol life was designed around surviving the brutal winters of the steppe. To understand this, we first need to understand the environment they lived in. The Mongolian steppe is one of the largest grassland ecosystems in the world. It stretches across modern-day Mongolia, parts of northern China, and into Central Asia. There are few forests, few mountains in many areas, and almost no natural shelter from the wind. When winter arrives, the land transforms into a frozen world. Snow covers the grasslands. Rivers freeze solid. The wind never seems to stop blowing. Temperatures can drop so low that exposed skin freezes quickly. But the Mongols had something that made survival possible: mobility. Unlike many farming societies that built permanent houses, the Mongols lived in portable homes called gers. Today, many people know them by another name: yurts. These round tents were one of the greatest survival tools ever designed for cold climates. A ger may look simple from the outside, but its design is incredibly smart. The frame is made from a lattice of wooden supports that form a circular wall. Long wooden poles stretch upward to create a domed roof. On top of this frame, thick layers of felt are placed. This felt is made from sheep wool that has been compressed and hardened through a process of moisture, pressure, and heat. Felt is an amazing material for insulation. It traps air inside its fibers, which helps keep heat inside the structure. The thicker the felt layers, the warmer the gyur becomes. In winter, Mongol families added extra layers of felt to their homes. These layers blocked the icy winds and helped retain warmth. Inside the gyur, a stove sat at the center. The stove burned wood, dried dung, or other available fuel. This central fire heated the entire structure. Because the gyur is circular, the heat spreads evenly throughout the space, and the low ceiling helps trap warmth inside. Even when the temperature outside dropped far below freezing, the inside of a gyur could remain comfortable. But the design included another clever feature. At the top of the roof was a circular opening called the crown. This opening allowed smoke from the stove to escape, but it also had a cover that could be adjusted. On calm days, it could remain open to let in sunlight and fresh air. During storms, it could be closed to keep heat inside. The simple but effective ventilation system prevented smoke buildup while maintaining warmth. The door of a gyur was always placed facing south. This wasn't random. Facing south allowed the home to receive maximum sunlight during the day, helping warm the interior naturally. It also protected the entrance from the strongest northern winds. The Mongols understood their environment deeply, and their homes reflected that knowledge. But housing was only one piece of the puzzle. Clothing played an equally important role. The Mongols wore a special coat called a deal. The deal was long, thick, and wrapped tightly around the body. It was usually made from wool, fur, or heavy cloth. During winter, people often wore several layers underneath. The deal was tied with a sash around the waist, which helped trap body heat. Because it was loose yet insulated, it allowed freedom of movement while maintaining warmth. This was extremely important for a culture built around horseback riding. Mongols spend much of their lives on horses, even in winter. Their boots were another essential piece of winter survival. They were made from thick leather and lined with fur. The boots were tall and sturdy, protecting legs from snow and wind. Unlike many modern shoes, they were designed specifically for riding and walking long distances in harsh conditions. Their hats were just as important. Mongol winter hats were usually made from fur and had ear flaps. These protected the head, ears, and neck from freezing winds. Because the body loses heat quickly through the head, these hats made a huge difference. Layers of fur, wool, and leather created a portable insulation system that people carried with them everywhere. But even the best clothing can't keep someone alive without enough energy. And this is where the Mongol diet played a crucial role. The Mongols were pastoral nomads. Their lives revolved around animals. They raised horses, sheep, goats, camels, and cattle. These animals provided almost everything they needed to survive winter. Meat was a major part of their diet. Animal fat, in particular, was extremely important. Fat contains a huge amount of calories, which help the body produce heat. Eating fatty meat helped Mongols stay warm during the cold months. They also consumed a wide range of dairy products. Milk from mares, cows, goats, sheep, and camels was used to make yogurt, cheese, butter, and fermented drinks. One famous drink was fermented mare's milk. This drink provided nutrients and energy during long journeys. Another advantage of their animal-based diet was food storage. Meat could be frozen naturally during winter. In the freezing temperatures of the steppe, meat stored outdoors stayed preserved for long periods. This made winter food supply much easier. And since Mongol families traveled with their herds, they always had access to fresh resources. Their animals also provided something just as important as food: fuel. Wood is scarce on the open steppe, but Mongols found another solution: dried animal dung. Dung from horses, cows, and sheep was collected and dried. Once dry, it burned surprisingly well. It produced steady heat and very little smoke. This fuel was essential for heating gers and cooking food. Without it, surviving winter would have been much harder. But the Mongols had another powerful survival advantage. Their lifestyle kept them constantly active. Moving animals, riding horses, building camps, and traveling long distances generated body heat. Unlike people sitting still in cold environments, Mongols were almost always moving. This helped their bodies maintain warmth. Even their military campaigns sometimes took place during winter. Enemies often assumed armies wouldn't move during the cold season. But Mongol forces used winter to their advantage. Frozen rivers became natural highways. Snow-covered landscapes made it easier for large groups of horses to travel. And the Mongols were already adapted to the cold. Armies that tried to chase or escape them often struggled in the harsh conditions. The Mongols, however, were at home in that environment. Their survival techniques weren't just about enduring winter. They turned winter into an advantage. But there are even more fascinating strategies the Mongols used to survive extreme cold, including how they slept, how they protected their animals, and how entire communities worked together to endure brutal winters. And some of these methods might surprise you, because the Mongols didn't just fight the winter. They learned how to live with it. Living through winter on the Mongolian steppe was not only about protecting people from the cold, it was also about protecting the animals that made Mongol life possible. For the Mongols, animals were not simply livestock, they were the foundation of survival. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels provided food, transportation, clothing materials, and fuel. Without these animals, life on the steppe would collapse almost immediately. But winter posed a serious threat to the herds. Heavy snow could cover the grasslands, making it difficult for animals to find food. Ice storms could trap grass beneath thick frozen layers. Strong winds could expose animals to freezing temperatures for long periods. The Mongols developed strategies to protect their herds through these harsh conditions. One of the most important strategies was constant movement. Nomadic life allowed Mongol families to move their animals to better grazing grounds when conditions became difficult. Instead of staying in one place and exhausting the land, they followed seasonal migration patterns that had been learned over generations. In autumn, before the worst cold arrived, families often moved their herds to valleys or areas where the terrain offered some protection from wind. These winter camps were chosen very carefully. Hills, rocky formations, or small forests could block strong northern winds. Even a slight natural barrier could dramatically reduce the cold felt by both people and animals. Snow accumulation was also an important factor. Some locations naturally had thinner snow cover because wind blew it away. In these places, animals could still reach the grass beneath the snow by digging with their hooves. Horses were especially important for this reason. Unlike some other livestock, horses are very good at scraping snow aside to reach grass. Once horses cleared the snow, other animals, such as sheep and goats, could graze in the same area. This made horse herds extremely valuable during winter. In fact, the Mongols depended heavily on their horses not only for travel and war, but also for helping maintain access to food sources during cold months. The Mongols also understood that different animals had different strengths in winter. Camels, for example, were extremely resistant to cold and could survive harsh temperatures surprisingly well. Their thick coats and large fat reserves helped them endure severe weather. Sheep provided wool and meat, while goats produced durable fibers used in textiles. Each animal played a role in the survival system. Another interesting strategy involved the way Mongol families arranged their camps. Gers were not placed randomly across the landscape. Camps were organized in ways that reduced wind exposure and improved efficiency. Sometimes multiple gers were arranged in clusters so they could shield one another from strong winds. Animal pens were also built nearby using temporary fencing or natural barriers. Keeping animals close to camp made it easier to protect them during storms or extreme cold. It also allowed families to monitor their herds more easily. During particularly harsh weather, animals might be gathered into tighter groups to reduce heat loss. The natural clustering helped animals share body warmth. Humans sometimes used a similar idea when sleeping close together inside the ger during the coldest nights. Inside the ger, daily life during winter followed a rhythm shaped by the environment. Morning often began before sunrise. The stove would be relit if the fire had burned low overnight. Someone in the household would step outside to check the animals and assess the weather. Even small changes in wind direction or snowfall could affect the day's plans. Meals were usually warm and filling. Soups made from meat and bones were common during winter because they provided both warmth and energy. Boiling bones released nutrients and fats into the broth, creating a highly nutritious meal. Tea was another essential part of Mongol winter life. But Mongol tea was very different from the sweet tea many people drink today. Traditional Mongol tea was often made with brick tea imported through trade routes. The tea was boiled in water and then mixed with milk, salt, and sometimes butter. This salty milk tea provided warmth, hydration, and calories. Drinking it regularly helped people stay energized throughout the day. Because the Mongols burned fuel inside their gers, the interior could become surprisingly warm compared to the freezing air outside. But this warmth had to be managed carefully. Too much heat could waste precious fuel, while too little could make the interior uncomfortable. The central stove became the heart of the home. People gathered around it to cook, eat, talk, and work. Children played nearby, while elders shared stories or repaired equipment. Winter evenings often became times for storytelling and oral history. Mongol culture has a rich tradition of spoken storytelling that passed knowledge from one generation to the next. Stories about ancestors, great battles, famous leaders, and ancient spirits filled the long winter nights. Among these stories were tales about the rise of the Mongol Empire and the legendary life of Genghis Khan. For many Mongols, these stories were not just entertainment. They were lessons about courage, survival, and unity. They also reinforced the values that helped communities endure harsh environments. Another fascinating part of winter survival involves sleep. Sleeping in extreme cold environments requires careful preparation. Inside the gear, people slept on thick layers of blankets and animal skins. Fur from sheep, goats, or other animals created natural insulation. Several layers could trap body heat effectively. Families often slept relatively close together, which helped conserve warmth during the coldest nights. The circular design of the gear also helped with nighttime warmth. Since heat from the stove rose toward the roof and spread across the curved interior, warm air circulated throughout the structure. Even after the fire burned low, the insulated walls slowed heat loss. But perhaps the most impressive survival advantage of the Mongols was their mental adaptation to the environment. People raised on the steppe developed a deep understanding of weather patterns, animal behavior, and seasonal changes. They could often sense approaching storms or temperature shifts long before modern forecasting tools existed. Experience taught them when to move camps, when to gather extra fuel, and when to prepare for dangerous weather. This knowledge was passed down through generations. Children learned survival skills from a very young age. They helped care for animals, gathered fuel, assisted with food preparation, and learned how to ride horses early in life. By adulthood, most Mongols had already spent years practicing the skills needed to survive winter. But even with all these strategies, winter on the steppe could still be dangerous. There was a particular type of disaster that Mongols feared more than almost anything else. It was known as a dzud. A dzud is a severe winter disaster in which animals cannot reach grass due to deep snow, ice layers, or extreme cold. When dzuds occur, entire herds can starve. For nomadic communities that depend heavily on livestock, this can be devastating. Historically, dzuds have caused massive animal losses and forced migrations. Because of this threat, Mongol families often tried to maintain diverse herds. If one type of animal suffered more in harsh weather, others might still survive. This diversity helped reduce risk. Community cooperation also played a role. Neighbors sometimes shared grazing areas, exchanged resources, or helped protect herds during extreme events. This social support network increased the chances that families could recover after difficult winters. Through a combination of mobility, animal management, strong housing design, warm clothing, calorie-rich diets, and community cooperation, the Mongols created one of the most effective cold weather survival systems in human history. But there is still another layer to this story. Because the Mongols didn't just survive winter as ordinary people. They also fought wars in it. And the way Mongol armies used winter conditions shocked their enemies and changed the course of history. For many civilizations throughout history, winter was a season of waiting. Armies stopped moving. Campaigns paused. Roads became difficult to travel, and cold weather drained energy from soldiers and animals. But for the Mongols, winter was not necessarily a time to stop. In fact, sometimes it was the perfect time to move. The warriors of the Mongol Empire had grown up in one of the harshest climates in the world. From childhood, they learned how to ride horses through snow, survive freezing winds, and travel long distances across the steppe. This meant that the cold conditions that slowed other armies often gave the Mongols an advantage. When Mongol forces rode across the landscape under the leadership of Genghis Khan, they carried with them a lifetime of experience surviving winter. Their enemies usually did not. This difference could decide entire wars. One of the biggest advantages the Mongols had in winter was mobility. Mongol armies were incredibly fast compared to most armies of the medieval world. Each warrior typically had several horses. Instead of riding one animal until it became exhausted, they rotated between horses during travel. This allowed them to cover enormous distances while keeping their animals relatively fresh. During winter, frozen ground made travel easier in some ways. Mud that slowed movement during warmer seasons disappeared when the land froze solid. Rivers that normally blocked travel turned into frozen pathways. Entire armies could cross rivers that would otherwise require bridges or boats. This opened new routes that enemy armies often failed to anticipate. Snow could also make the Mongols harder to detect. Large movements across grassy plains sometimes left obvious trails in warmer seasons. But during certain winter conditions, wind and snowfall quickly erased tracks. Mongol forces could approach their targets with greater secrecy. The cold itself sometimes became a weapon. Many enemy soldiers were poorly prepared for harsh winter campaigns. Their clothing might not provide enough insulation, and their supply systems could break down in extreme weather. Food supplies froze or became difficult to transport. Morale often dropped as soldiers struggled against the cold. Mongol warriors, however, were used to these conditions. They wore heavy deals made of wool, fur, and thick cloth. Their boots were designed for both riding and walking through snow. Fur hats protected their ears and heads from freezing winds. Even more importantly, their lifestyle had trained their bodies to handle cold temperatures. Because Mongol warriors were also nomadic herders, they were used to long days outdoors caring for animals regardless of the weather. This physical adaptation made them much more resilient than many of their opponents. Food was another major factor. Unlike many armies that depended entirely on supply lines, Mongol forces often carried their food sources with them. Horses could provide milk and, if necessary, meat. Mongol soldiers also traveled with dried meat and dairy products that could last long periods without spoiling. In extreme situations, warriors could even drink small amounts of horse blood without killing the animal. This provided quick nutrition and energy during long journeys. Although this practice was not common everyday behavior, it shows how adaptable Mongol survival methods could be. Their ability to live off their animals allowed Mongol armies to travel with remarkable independence. While other armies struggled when supply lines broke down, Mongol forces could continue moving. Winter landscapes sometimes made these movements even more efficient. Another advantage was psychological. Enemies rarely expected attacks during the coldest months. Winter storms, freezing winds, and snow-covered terrain seemed like natural barriers to military action. But the Mongols often used these assumptions to surprise their enemies. One famous example occurred during campaigns against powerful kingdoms in northern China. The Mongols launched attacks during winter months when defending armies believed major invasions were unlikely. Frozen rivers allowed Mongol cavalry to cross natural defenses quickly. Cities that expected safety behind water barriers suddenly found Mongol horsemen appearing on the other side. The shock of these unexpected winter attacks often weakened enemy resistance. Mongol warfare relied heavily on speed, coordination, and surprise. Winter conditions sometimes amplified all three. But military campaigns in freezing temperatures still required careful preparation. Horses needed protection, just like humans. Mongol horses were tough animals, smaller than many war horses used by other cultures, but incredibly resilient. They had thick winter coats and strong bodies adapted to the steppe environment. These horses could dig through snow to reach grass, reducing the need for large supplies of feed. Their ability to survive on natural grazing allowed Mongol armies to travel light and move quickly. During severe storms, however, even these hardy animals needed shelter. Mongol camps sometimes used natural terrain to block wind and provide protection. Hillsides, valleys, or forest edges offered better conditions than open plains. Just as nomadic families positioned their winter camps carefully, Mongol armies chose their temporary camps with similar awareness of the environment. Inside camp, soldiers relied on the same basic survival tools used in everyday Mongol life. Portable gears could sometimes accompany large groups, though smaller tents were also used during military campaigns. Fires burned using dried animal dung or other available fuel. Warm clothing and layered blankets protected warriors during the night. And just like in family camps, the circular arrangement of tents or shelters helped reduce wind exposure. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Mongol winter survival was their endurance. Historical accounts describe Mongol riders traveling extraordinary distances in extremely cold conditions. They could ride for days across frozen landscapes, stopping briefly to rest horses before continuing their journey. Their ability to move quickly across such harsh environments shocked many of their enemies. This endurance came not only from physical strength, but also from mental discipline. Life on the steppe had prepared Mongols for hardship. Cold winds, long rides, and unpredictable weather were part of everyday life. When these conditions appeared during war, Mongol soldiers simply treated them as another part of the environment. Meanwhile, their opponents often struggled both physically and mentally. Winter warfare required strong leadership as well. Leaders needed to understand the limits of their warriors and animals while also taking advantage of opportunities created by weather conditions. One of the greatest strengths of Genghis Khan was his ability to organize and coordinate large forces under difficult circumstances. His commanders followed strict discipline and communication systems. Signals, messengers, and carefully planned routes allowed Mongol armies to operate efficiently even across vast winter landscapes. And while winter warfare brought risks, it also brought rewards. Enemies caught unprepared in cold conditions could collapse quickly. Cities isolated by snow or frozen terrain sometimes struggled to receive reinforcements. The Mongols understood these weaknesses and used them effectively. But winter survival was not only about armies and battles. For ordinary Mongol families living across the steppe, winter still meant months of careful planning, cooperation, and resilience. Their ability to endure these seasons year after year created the foundation that made Mongol military power possible. Because an army that can survive winter is an army that can move when others cannot. Yet even beyond warfare, the daily techniques the Mongols used to stay warm and healthy in extreme cold were remarkable. From the way they built their beds to the way they managed fire inside their homes, every small detail played a role in survival. And some of those small details reveal just how deeply Mongol culture was shaped by life in one of the coldest inhabited regions on Earth. When winter fully settled across the Mongolian steppe, life slowed down in some ways, but it never truly stopped. Families still had animals to care for, food to prepare, and daily routines that kept their small communities functioning even in the most freezing weather. Inside the warm circle of a gyr, winter life followed rhythms that had been practiced for generations. The gyr itself was more than just a shelter from the cold. It was a carefully organized living space where every section had a purpose. When someone stepped inside a gyr, they would immediately notice the central stove. The stove sat directly in the middle of the floor and acted as the heart of the home. A metal pipe extended upward through the roof opening, allowing smoke to escape while heat filled the interior. This fire was incredibly important during winter. Without it, the thick felt walls would slow the cold but could not completely stop it. The fire needed to be maintained carefully throughout the day. Too little fuel and the warmth would fade quickly. Too much fuel and valuable resources would be wasted. Fuel itself was something Mongol families managed very carefully. Since trees were rare on much of the steppe, wood was not always easy to find. Instead, one of the most common fuels used in Mongol households was dried animal dung. Dung from horses, cattle, sheep, and goats was collected regularly, shaped into small pieces and left to dry in the sun during warmer seasons. By the time winter arrived, these pieces had hardened into effective fuel. When burned in the stove, dried dung produced steady heat and relatively little smoke. It was lightweight, easy to transport, and surprisingly efficient. Many people unfamiliar with life on the steppe find this practice unusual, but for nomadic cultures, it was one of the most reliable energy sources available. Around the edges of the gyr, the living space was carefully arranged. Beds, storage chests, tools, clothing, and cooking supplies were placed in specific positions. Mongol homes followed traditional layouts that organized space according to custom and practicality. The northern side of the gyr was usually the most honored area. Important items, family heirlooms, or religious objects were often placed there. Guests might also be seated in that direction as a sign of respect. Everyday items such as cooking tools and food storage were placed in other areas that were easier to access. This organization helped families move efficiently inside the limited space. During winter, much of the daily work happened indoors whenever possible. Clothing had to be repaired, tools maintained, and equipment prepared for the coming seasons. Women often spent time sewing or repairing garments made from wool, leather, or fur. Because winter clothing was essential for survival, damaged coats or boots had to be fixed quickly. The traditional Mongol coat, known as a deal, was one of the most important garments in winter life. These coats were thick and layered, often lined with fur for extra warmth. They wrapped around the body and were tied with a sash at the waist. This design helped trap body heat and protect against strong winds. Even more importantly, the deal was extremely practical. The long sleeves protected hands, the loose design allowed movement, and the belt could be used to carry tools or small objects. Some people even used their sash as a temporary rope or strap when working outdoors. Layering was another key strategy. Underneath the outer coat, Mongols often wore multiple layers made from wool or other warm materials. These layers created pockets of trapped air that helped hold body heat close to the skin. Fur was especially valuable in winter clothing. Fur-lined hats, boots, and coats offered natural insulation that worked extremely well against cold winds. Boots were particularly important. Walking across frozen ground for long periods could quickly lead to frostbite if feet were not protected properly. Mongol boots were usually made from strong leather and lined with fur or thick fabric. They were tall enough to cover the lower legs and prevent snow from entering. The soles were designed for riding horses, but also worked well for walking across snow-covered land. Hats were another essential part of winter survival. Mongol hats often had fur linings and ear flaps that protected the head and neck from wind. Because the human body loses a significant amount of heat through the head, covering it properly helped preserve warmth. But clothing alone was not enough to survive the cold. Diet played an equally important role. Winter meals needed to provide enough energy to keep people warm and active. One of the most common foods during winter was meat. Sheep, goats, cattle, and sometimes horses were used as sources of meat for Mongol families. Meat could be boiled, dried, or preserved in various ways depending on the situation. Fat was especially valuable. Fat contains a large amount of energy, and eating fatty foods helped the body produce heat in cold environments. This made fatty cuts of meat extremely important during winter months. Bone soups were another common meal. Bones were boiled for long periods, releasing nutrients and fat into the broth. The resulting soup was warm, nourishing, and filling. It also helped prevent waste by extracting every bit of nutrition from the animal. Dairy products were also central to the Mongol diet. Milk from animals such as horses, cows, goats, sheep, and camels was used to produce a variety of foods. These included cheese, yogurt, butter, and dried curds. Some dairy products could be stored for long periods, which was extremely helpful during winter when fresh resources were more limited. Tea was another important part of daily life. But Mongol tea was very different from the sweet teas many people drink today. Traditional Mongol tea was often made using compressed brick tea that arrived through trade routes from China and other regions. The tea was boiled in water and then mixed with milk and salt. Sometimes butter was added as well. This drink was warm, nourishing, and full of calories. People drank it many times throughout the day. It helped maintain hydration and provided steady energy during long, cold days. Even something as simple as drinking warm tea could make a big difference in maintaining body temperature. During winter evenings, families gathered around the stove after finishing their daily tasks. These moments often became times for conversation storytelling. The Mongols have a long tradition of oral storytelling that carried history, legends, and cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. Stories about ancestors, heroic warriors, great journeys, and mysterious spirits filled the long winter nights. Among the most famous figures in these stories was Genghis Khan. For many Mongols, stories about his life and the rise of the Mongol Empire were part of cultural identity. Children listened carefully, learning not only about history, but also about values such as courage, loyalty, and resilience. Storytelling was not just entertainment. It was education. It helped preserve knowledge in a society where written texts were less common than spoken traditions. Winter nights were also a time for music. Traditional instruments like the morankur, often called the horsehead fiddle, produced haunting melodies that echoed through the warm interior of the gers. These sounds contrasted beautifully with the silent, frozen landscape outside. Music, stories, and shared meals helped maintain strong family bonds during long winters. This sense of community and cooperation was essential for survival. Life on the steppe was difficult, and no family could thrive entirely alone. Neighbors often supported each other when storms arrived or when animals needed extra care. Sharing information about grazing conditions, weather patterns, or animal health helped everyone adapt to changing circumstances. This culture of cooperation strengthened communities and helped them endure difficult seasons. But even with all these systems in place, winter still demanded constant attention. Weather on the steppe could change suddenly. A calm morning might turn into a powerful snowstorm by afternoon. Strong winds could drive temperatures even lower, creating dangerous conditions for people and animals outside. Because of this, Mongol families always remained alert to changes in the environment. They watched the sky, the movement of clouds, and the behavior of animals. These signs often revealed what kind of weather might arrive next. Understanding these signals allowed families to prepare early, gather animals closer to camp, and secure their homes before storms arrived. Over generations, this deep awareness of nature became one of the most powerful survival skills Mongol communities possessed. But winter survival on the steppe was not only about protecting people and homes. The animals that sustained Mongol life still faced constant challenges, from snow, wind, and freezing temperatures. And protecting those herds sometimes required creative solutions that revealed just how adaptable Mongol culture truly was. For the Mongols, surviving winter was never just about protecting themselves. It was also about protecting their animals. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels were not simply resources. They were the backbone of life on the steppe. These animals provided food, clothing materials, transportation, and even fuel. Without them, survival in such a harsh environment would have been nearly impossible. This meant that winter survival depended heavily on the health and safety of the herds. Mongol families spent much of their time ensuring that their animals could endure the freezing months. Among all the animals they raised, one stood above the rest in importance: the horse. Mongol horses were smaller than many of the large war horses used in Europe, but they were incredibly tough and perfectly adapted to the steppe environment. These horses had thick winter coats that protected them from freezing winds. They were strong, resilient, and able to travel long distances without needing large amounts of food. More importantly, Mongol horses had a natural ability that made them extremely valuable during winter. They could dig through snow to reach the grass underneath. When snow covered the steppe, horses would scrape the surface with their hooves, clearing patches where grass could still be reached. Once the horses exposed the grass, other animals, such as sheep and goats, could graze in the same area. This made horses an essential part of winter survival for entire herds. Because of this, Mongol herders often placed great care in managing and protecting their horses. The animals were monitored closely for signs of illness, injury, or exhaustion. Healthy horses meant healthy herds and reliable transportation. And transportation meant the ability to move if conditions became too dangerous. Mobility remained one of the Mongols' greatest survival tools. If snow became too deep or grazing became scarce, families could relocate to better areas. This nomadic lifestyle allowed them to avoid some of the worst environmental dangers that might trap more sedentary communities. But winter migration was not something done randomly. Mongol herders possessed deep knowledge of the land. They understood which valleys offered protection from wind, which hillsides gathered less snow, and which areas still allowed animals to find food beneath the frozen ground. These winter camps were chosen very carefully. Even a small natural barrier, like a hill or rocky ridge, could reduce wind exposure dramatically. Wind chill often made the cold far more dangerous than temperature alone. Blocking that wind could make survival much easier for both animals and humans. Another important factor was water. Even in winter, animals needed regular access to water sources. Frozen rivers and streams sometimes had to be broken open so animals could drink. In other cases, herders guided their animals to springs that remained partially unfrozen. Managing these resources required constant attention. A mistake could lead to weakened animals, which would struggle to survive harsh weather. Snow itself could also create challenges. A light layer of snow was not usually a problem because animals could still reach the grass beneath. But when snow became deep, or when freezing rain created layers of ice over the ground, grazing became much harder. This kind of event could lead to a disaster known as a dzud. A dzud is one of the most feared natural disasters in Mongolia. It occurs when animals cannot access food because the ground is covered by thick snow or ice for extended periods. In such conditions, animals may starve even though grass lies beneath the frozen surface. Historically, dzuds have caused the loss of millions of animals in Mongolia. For nomadic families who depend entirely on their herds, this could be devastating. Because of this threat, Mongol herders developed several strategies to reduce risk. One of the most important strategies was herd diversity. Instead of relying on a single type of animal, families usually raised several different species. Each species had different strengths in harsh weather. Horses could dig through snow. Camels had thick coats and strong endurance in extreme cold. Sheep and goats provided wool, meat, and milk. Cattle offered additional sources of dairy and labor. By maintaining a mix of animals, families increased their chances that at least some of their livestock would survive difficult winters. Another strategy involved herd movement. Animals were not always kept in one large group. Instead, herders sometimes divided their animals into smaller groups and spread them across nearby grazing areas. This reduced pressure on any single patch of land and allowed more efficient use of limited grass resources. When storms approached, animals might be gathered closer to camp for protection. Temporary shelters or natural barriers could reduce wind exposure and help animals conserve body heat. But Mongol herders rarely built permanent barns or large structures. Their animals were generally hardy enough to survive outdoors. Over generations, these animals had adapted to the climate of the steppe. Their thick fur, strong bodies, and natural behaviors helped them endure the cold. Horses, for example, often stood close together during storms. By forming tight groups, they reduced heat loss and shielded one another from wind. This behavior allowed them to survive conditions that might kill less adapted animals. Herders also watched their animals closely for signs of trouble. If a horse became injured or too weak to travel, it might be moved closer to camp for extra care. Newborn animals received special attention as well, since young animals were more vulnerable to cold temperatures. Even the placement of camps played a role in animal protection. By choosing locations with natural wind barriers, families reduced the exposure of their herds to freezing gusts. These small advantages could make the difference between survival and loss. But animals were not only important for food and transportation. They also provided materials that helped Mongol families stay warm. Wool from sheep was used to produce felt, the thick insulating material that covered the walls of gers. Felt was essential for winter survival. Its dense fibers trapped air and slowed the movement of heat, helping keep warm air inside the home. Fur from animals such as sheep, foxes, or other creatures was used to line coats, hats, and boots. These natural materials provided insulation that modern synthetic fabrics often try to imitate. Leather from animal hides became durable clothing and equipment. Boots, belts, saddles, bags, and tools were all crafted from materials provided by the herd. In this way, the animals supported nearly every aspect of Mongol winter life. They provided warmth, mobility, food, and shelter materials. The relationship between Mongol herders and their animals was therefore extremely close. Herders spent countless hours observing their animals, learning their behavior, and understanding their needs. This deep knowledge allowed them to respond quickly when conditions changed. It also helped them predict dangers before they became disasters. But animals also played another surprising role in helping Mongols survive the winter cold. They helped generate warmth. Inside gers, animal skins and furs provided bedding that trapped body heat during sleep. Outside, the presence of large herds around camp sometimes reduced wind exposure and created slightly warmer microenvironments. Even the dung produced by these animals became valuable fuel for fires. This complete system of animal-based resources allowed Mongol communities to thrive in places where farming would have been extremely difficult. And this lifestyle produced people who were incredibly resilient. By growing up in an environment where winter survival depended on careful observation, constant movement, and cooperation with animals, Mongols developed skills that few other societies possessed. These skills helped them not only survive, but also build one of the most powerful empires in history under the leadership of Genghis Khan. But winter life on the steppe involved more than just survival strategies and herd management. There were also traditions, beliefs, and cultural practices that shaped how Mongol communities viewed the harsh environment around them. Surviving the brutal winters of the Mongolian steppe required more than physical strength, warm clothing, or clever shelters. It also required a powerful mental and cultural connection to the natural world. For the Mongols, the land was not simply a place where they lived. It was something deeply respected, something alive with meaning and spiritual presence. This worldview shaped how Mongol communities understood winter and the harsh forces of nature surrounding them. Instead of seeing winter as an enemy to be conquered, many Mongols believed it was a natural part of life that must be respected and understood. For centuries, Mongol spiritual beliefs were influenced by a tradition known as Tengrism. Tengrism centered around the worship of the eternal blue sky known as Tengri. In this belief system, the sky, earth, mountains, rivers, and winds were all part of a vast spiritual balance. People believed that humans existed within this balance rather than above it. This mindset encouraged respect for the natural environment and careful observation of the world around them. Winter storms, freezing winds, and harsh temperatures were not viewed simply as random events. They were part of the natural order of the steppe. Understanding this helped Mongol communities develop patience and resilience when facing difficult seasons. Spiritual leaders known as shamans played an important role in this cultural system. Shamans were believed to communicate with spirits and interpret signs from nature. They sometimes performed rituals asking for protection during dangerous weather or guidance during uncertain times. These rituals could include offerings, prayers, or symbolic acts intended to restore harmony between humans and the natural world. While these practices may seem mysterious today, they provided psychological strength for people living in extremely unpredictable environments. Believing that the natural world had meaning and balance helped communities endure hardship. It reminded them that harsh winters were temporary and part of a larger cycle. This idea of cycles was very important in Mongol life. The year was divided into seasons that guided migration patterns, herd management, and daily routines. Spring brought new life and newborn animals. Summer offered rich grazing lands and warmth. Autumn became a time for preparation, and winter was the season that tested every skill and system developed during the rest of the year. Preparation for winter began long before the first snow appeared. Families worked throughout autumn to gather fuel, repair clothing, strengthen their gears, and ensure their animals were healthy. Extra layers of felt might be added to the walls of the ger. Clothing would be inspected and repaired. Dried foods and preserved dairy products were stored for later use. These preparations reduced stress once winter arrived. When the cold finally settled across the steppe, Mongol families relied on routines that helped maintain both physical and mental stability. Daily tasks gave structure to long winter days. Caring for animals, preparing meals, maintaining fires, and repairing equipment kept people active and focused. Even during harsh weather, there was always work to do. The sense of purpose helped prevent the feeling of helplessness that extreme conditions can create. Community also played a major role in winter survival. Although nomadic families often lived some distance from one another, they remained connected through shared knowledge and cooperation. Neighbors might visit one another during calmer days to exchange news, share food, or help solve problems. If one family experienced difficulties, others might assist by lending animals, sharing supplies, or helping move herds. These cooperative relationships increased the resilience of entire communities. No family had to face the challenges of winter completely alone. Winter evenings inside the ger often became moments of warmth, not just physically, but socially. After finishing daily tasks, families gathered around the central stove. The fire crackled quietly while wind moved across the frozen steppe outside. Inside, the atmosphere could feel peaceful and safe. Storytelling remained one of the most important traditions during these evenings. Through stories, elders passed down knowledge about the past, lessons about survival, and tales about legendary figures. Among these figures, the story of Genghis Khan held a special place. His rise from a difficult childhood on the steppe to the leader of a vast empire inspired generations of Mongols. Stories about his leadership, intelligence, and determination reinforced cultural values such as resilience and unity. But storytelling also served a practical purpose. It helped pass down survival knowledge. Through stories, children learned about past winters, dangerous storms, and the clever decisions their ancestors made to overcome them. These lessons became part of collective memory. Music was another important part of winter life. Traditional instruments like the horsehead fiddle produced soft, emotional sounds that echoed inside the ger. Songs often told stories of the land, the animals, and the journeys of the people. These songs strengthened cultural identity and helped people feel connected to their environment, even during long, dark nights. Food also played a role in maintaining morale during winter. Warm meals and hot drinks provided comfort in addition to nutrition. One of the most common drinks was salty milk tea. This tea combined boiled brick tea with milk, salt, and sometimes butter. It was rich, warming, and full of energy. People drank it many times throughout the day. Meals made from meat, fat, and dairy products helped maintain body heat and strength. The Mongol diet was perfectly suited for cold environments because it focused on high-calorie foods. These foods provided the energy necessary to perform physical work and maintain warmth in freezing temperatures. Sleep was also carefully managed. Inside the ger, families slept on thick bedding made from furs and blankets. Several layers of animal skins created natural insulation between the sleepers and the cold ground. Sleeping close together helped preserve body heat during the coldest nights. The circular structure of the ger helped distribute warmth from the stove evenly throughout the space. Even when the fire burned low, the thick felt walls slowed heat loss. This combination of insulation, bedding, and shared warmth allowed families to sleep comfortably even when temperatures outside dropped far below freezing. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of Mongol winter survival was their mindset. People raised on the steppe did not view winter as something abnormal or terrifying. It was simply a reality of life. They understood its dangers, but they also trusted their knowledge and traditions. This confidence allowed them to remain calm and focused during difficult situations. Instead of panicking when storms arrived, they relied on skills learned over generations. These mental qualities were just as important as physical tools. Resilience, patience, and adaptability helped Mongol communities endure winters that would seem impossible to many outsiders. This deep connection between culture, environment, and survival shaped Mongol society in powerful ways. It produced people who could travel long distances in freezing weather, care for large herds in difficult conditions, and even launch military campaigns during winter months. These abilities contributed directly to the success of the Mongol Empire under leaders like Genghis Khan. But even beyond empire building, the everyday survival techniques developed on the steppe remain impressive examples of human adaptation. Every part of Mongol life, their homes, clothing, food, animals, traditions, and beliefs, work together as one system designed for survival. And there are still a few more fascinating details about how Mongols handled extreme cold that reveal just how advanced their knowledge of winter survival truly was. By the time winter reached its coldest point on the Mongolian steppe, survival depended on dozens of small habits and practical tricks that had been refined over generations. These details might seem simple, but together they created a powerful system that allowed Mongol families to live comfortably in temperatures that could fall far below freezing. One of the most important of these habits involved managing body heat. Cold environments drain energy quickly, and if the body loses too much heat, it becomes difficult to stay warm again. Mongols understood that preventing heat loss was far easier than trying to restore warmth after it was gone. Because of this, their clothing was designed not only for warmth, but also for efficiency. The traditional coat, known as the deal, wrapped tightly around the body, creating layers that trapped warm air inside. This trapped air acted as insulation, slowing the movement of heat away from the body. The sash tied around the waist played a surprisingly important role. By tightening the coat around the midsection, it helped seal warm air inside the clothing. At the same time, it prevented cold wind from entering through gaps in the fabric. Another advantage of the deal was its versatility. The long design covered most of the body, protecting both the upper legs and the torso from wind and snow. When necessary, people could even pull their hands inside the sleeves to warm them temporarily. This small trick helped prevent frostbite during long rides or outdoor work. Layering clothing was another important technique. Instead of relying on one extremely thick garment, Mongols often wore multiple layers made from wool, fur, or heavy cloth. Each layer trapped small pockets of air. These pockets acted like barriers, slowing the movement of cold air towards the skin. Even if the outer layer became damp or exposed to wind, the inner layers still retained warmth. Boots also played a crucial role. Feet lose heat quickly when standing on frozen ground. If feet become too cold, the entire body begins losing warmth faster. Mongol boots were designed with thick leather and insulating linings, often made from fur. They were tall enough to cover a part of the leg and prevent snow from entering. Inside the boots, people sometimes placed additional layers such as wool or felt to increase insulation. These materials helped keep feet dry and warm during long hours outdoors. Another, lesser-known winter survival trick involved controlling moisture. Sweat can be dangerous in cold environments. If someone sweats heavily while working and then stops moving, the moisture in their clothing can cool quickly and lead to rapid heat loss. Mongols learned to manage their activity carefully. When working outdoors, they avoided overheating by adjusting clothing layers. If they began to feel too warm, they might loosen their sash or open their coat slightly. This allowed excess heat to escape without soaking their clothing with sweat. This simple practice helped prevent sudden chills later in the day. Fire management inside the gear was another skill that required careful attention. The central stove produced heat for the entire home, but it needed constant monitoring. Fuel had to be added slowly and evenly. If too much fuel was burned too quickly, the fire might burn out earlier than expected. If too little fuel was used, the interior temperature could drop too low during the night. Families developed routines to keep the fire burning steadily. Before going to sleep, they often added extra fuel to ensure the fire lasted longer. Sometimes someone would wake briefly during the night to check the stove and add more fuel if needed. These small actions helped maintain warmth until morning. The thick felt covering the gear also required regular maintenance. Felt is excellent insulation, but it can absorb moisture from snow or rain. If the felt became too damp, it could lose some of its insulating ability. To prevent this, Mongol families occasionally removed sections of felt during dry weather so they could air out and dry properly. Keeping the felt in good condition ensured that the gear remained an effective barrier against wind and cold. Another interesting winter habit involved how people positioned themselves inside the gear. The area closest to the stove was naturally the warmest. Cooking, eating, and many indoor tasks happened near this central space. Sleeping areas were arranged along the edges of the circular structure. But thick bedding made from furs and blankets created strong insulation against the cold floor. Several layers of animal skins trapped body heat and prevented cold from rising through the ground. Families often slept relatively close together during the coldest nights. This helped conserve warmth. Body heat from multiple people created a slightly warmer environment than sleeping alone. While this might seem simple, it was an effective way to maintain warmth during extremely cold nights. Food preparation also included techniques designed for winter survival. Meals were often warm and rich in calories. High-fat foods helped the body generate heat during digestion. Fatty meat, bone broth, dairy products, and warm tea provided steady energy throughout the day. Another practical advantage of winter was natural refrigeration. The freezing temperatures allowed meat to be stored outdoors without spoiling. In some cases, meat could remain frozen for weeks or even months. This made it easier to store large quantities of food without needing special preservation methods. People could simply cut pieces from frozen meat when needed and cook them over the stove. Water management was another daily challenge. Rivers, streams, and small lakes often froze during winter. Mongol families sometimes had to break ice to collect water for drinking and cooking. In other cases, snow could be melted over the stove to produce water. This required extra fuel, but provided a reliable backup when liquid water was unavailable. Despite these challenges, Mongol communities developed efficient systems to handle winter conditions. Children learned these skills from an early age. Helping with animals, gathering fuel, and assisting with daily tasks taught them how to survive in a demanding environment. By the time they reached adulthood, most Mongols had years of experience dealing with freezing temperatures and sudden storms. This practical education created generations of people who were highly skilled in cold weather survival. These survival abilities also helped create one of the most formidable military cultures in history. Warriors raised in such harsh conditions were naturally resilient. They could travel long distances, endure freezing winds, and remain active even in brutal weather. This endurance contributed to the success of the Mongol Empire led by Genghis Khan. His armies often moved faster and operated more effectively in winter than their enemies expected. But even beyond warfare, the everyday survival system of the Mongols remains one of the most impressive examples of human adaptation to extreme climate. Their homes, clothing, animals, food, and traditions all work together as a unified system. Every detail had a purpose, and each small habit added another layer of protection against the cold. By combining practical knowledge, cultural traditions, and deep understanding of the natural world, Mongol communities managed to live successfully in one of the coldest environments inhabited by large populations. But there is still another fascinating aspect of Mongol winter survival that often surprises historians. Even in these freezing conditions, Mongol travelers and messengers sometimes crossed enormous distances in remarkably short times. Their communication network stretched across vast territories even during winter months. As the Mongol Empire expanded across Asia and into parts of Europe, one of the greatest challenges its leaders faced was communication. An empire that stretched thousands of kilometers could not function without a reliable way to send messages, orders, and information quickly across vast distances. And this challenge became even greater during winter. Snow-covered plains, frozen rivers, and brutal winds made travel extremely difficult for most people. But the Mongols developed a system that allowed communication to continue even during the coldest months. This system became known as the Yam. The Yam was a network of relay stations spread across the territories of the Mongol Empire. These stations were positioned along major routes at regular intervals. At each station, fresh horses, supplies, and sometimes shelter were available for messengers traveling across the empire. When a messenger arrived at one station, they could quickly switch to a new horse and continue their journey without delay. This relay system allowed messages to travel at remarkable speeds. Instead of one rider covering an entire distance alone, multiple riders shared the journey, each covering shorter sections. This reduced fatigue and kept the communication network running efficiently. The Yam system became one of the most advanced communication networks of the medieval world, and it continued operating even during winter. The reason this was possible is closely connected to the winter survival skills Mongols had developed over generations. Messengers traveling across the frozen steppe wore the same layered clothing used by ordinary Mongols. Thick deals made from wool or fur protected them from the wind. Fur-lined hats covered their ears and heads. Heavy boots insulated their feet during long hours in the saddle. But clothing alone was not enough. These riders also relied on their deep knowledge of the land. They knew which routes were safest during winter, and which areas might become dangerous due to snowstorms or ice. Frozen rivers sometimes became natural roads during the cold months. While rivers could block travel during warmer seasons, winter turned them into smooth, frozen pathways. Messengers could ride across them quickly, avoiding obstacles that might slow them down during other times of the year. The Mongols understood how to use these conditions to their advantage. They also relied heavily on their horses. Mongol horses were incredibly well adapted to the steppe environment. They had thick winter coats and strong endurance. Even in freezing temperatures, these animals could continue traveling long distances. When one horse became tired, A fresh horse at the next relay station allowed the messenger to continue almost immediately. This constant rotation kept travel speed high. Some historical records suggest that Mongol messengers could travel hundreds of kilometers in just a few days. That speed was astonishing for the medieval world, and maintaining such speed during winter was even more impressive. The Yam system was carefully organized under the leadership of the Mongol Empire's founders, including Genghis Khan. He understood that controlling such a vast empire required strong communication. Orders needed to reach distant generals quickly. Reports from distant regions needed to reach the central leadership without delay. Without a reliable communication network, the empire could easily fall into chaos. Because of this, the relay stations were treated as extremely important infrastructure. Local communities were often responsible for helping maintain these stations. They provided horses, food, and sometimes shelter for official messengers. Travelers carrying official documents were given priority access to these resources. This system made it possible for messages to travel across enormous distances faster than many people believed possible at the time. Even in winter, when other societies slowed down dramatically, the Mongol Empire could continue operating effectively. Messengers braved the cold winds and frozen plains to keep information flowing. But traveling through winter landscapes still required careful planning. Storms could appear suddenly across the steppe. Strong winds sometimes created blinding snow conditions that made navigation difficult. Experienced riders learned to recognize warning signs in the sky and landscape. Cloud patterns, wind shifts, and even animal behavior could signal an approaching storm. When storms became too severe, travelers sometimes waited at relay stations until conditions improved. These stations often served as small islands of safety across the vast open land. Inside, fires burned to provide warmth. Food and tea restored energy. Fresh horses rested in nearby enclosures. Once the weather improved, the riders continued their journey. The Mongols also used special passes and documents that identified official travelers. These passes allowed messengers to request assistance at relay stations. Without them, travelers might not receive the same level of support. This system ensured that important communications moved efficiently across the empire. Beyond messengers, merchants and travelers also benefited from this network. The safety and organization of the Mongol relay system helped trade routes flourish. Goods, information, and ideas moved more easily across the territories controlled by the Mongols. This exchange connected distant regions of Asia, the Middle East, and Europe in ways that had rarely occurred before. Winter did not completely stop this movement. Instead, the Mongols adapted their travel methods to the season. Frozen terrain sometimes allowed faster travel than muddy ground in warmer months. With proper clothing, reliable horses, and well-placed relay stations, riders could cross huge distances even in freezing conditions. The ability to maintain communication during winter strengthened the power of the Mongol Empire. Leaders could coordinate armies, manage distant territories, and respond quickly to threats. Without this system, governing such a massive empire would have been far more difficult. But beyond the empire itself, these communication networks also demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of Mongol society. Their survival skills allowed them to operate effectively in environments that many others considered impossible. Whether herding animals, managing families, fighting wars, or carrying messages across frozen landscapes, Mongols used the same basic principles of survival: mobility, preparation, cooperation, and deep knowledge of the natural world. These principles helped them endure winters that could reach some of the coldest temperatures experienced by human communities. But even with their experience and knowledge, the Mongols still faced moments when winter became extremely dangerous. Powerful storms, sudden temperature drops, and disasters like dzoods could still threaten entire communities. When those events occurred, survival depended on quick decisions and the strength of social bonds within the community. Even with all their experience and preparation, winter on the Mongolian steppe could still become incredibly dangerous. Most winters followed predictable patterns. Temperatures dropped, snow covered the land, and families relied on the systems they had built over generations to survive. But sometimes winter behaved differently. Sometimes nature pushed those systems to their limits. One of the most feared events in Mongolian history was the disaster known as a dzood. A dzood was not simply a cold winter. It was a combination of extreme weather conditions that made survival extremely difficult for both animals and humans. There were several different types of dzoods. In some cases, heavy snow covered the grasslands so deeply that animals could not reach the grass beneath. In other cases, freezing rain created a hard layer of ice over the ground. Even though grass still existed below the ice, animals could not break through it to feed. Another type of dzood occurred when extremely cold temperatures weakened animals over long periods. Even if food was available, the animals might become too weak to survive the continuous cold. For nomadic families who depended almost entirely on their livestock, these disasters could be devastating. If large numbers of animals died, families could lose their primary source of food, clothing materials, transportation, and trade goods. Because of this, Mongol communities developed strategies to respond quickly when signs of a dzood began to appear. One of the most important responses was movement. Nomadic life gave Mongol families the ability to relocate when conditions became too severe. If grazing areas became completely inaccessible due to snow or ice, herders might move their animals to different regions where conditions were better. These migrations could be difficult during winter, but they sometimes saved entire herds. Knowledge of the landscape played a critical role during these moments. Herders knew which valleys might have thinner snow cover. They knew where wind often blew snow away, exposing patches of grass. They knew which slopes received more sunlight and might melt slightly during the day. These small environmental differences could make the difference between survival and starvation for animals. Another important strategy involved cooperation between families. Neighbors often shared information about grazing conditions and weather patterns. If one area became too dangerous for animals, nearby families might warn others before the situation became worse. Sometimes families temporarily combined their herds so they could manage them more effectively. This cooperation increased the chances that at least some animals would survive the harsh conditions. Food sharing also occurred during extremely difficult winters. Families who still had healthy herds might assist those who had suffered heavy losses. These acts of support helped communities recover once the winter ended. The Mongols understood that survival on the steppe depended on strong relationships between people. No family could guarantee survival entirely on their own. Winter storms could also create immediate dangers. Powerful blizzards sometimes swept across the steppe with little warning. Strong winds drove snow through the air, reducing visibility and making travel extremely difficult. In these conditions, even experienced riders could become disoriented. When storms approached, families usually focused on securing their animals and reinforcing their camps. Animals might be gathered closer together so they could share body warmth. Camps were sometimes repositioned behind hills or natural barriers that blocked strong winds. Inside the gear, families ensured that the felt coverings were tightly secured. Loose sections of felt could allow freezing air to enter the home. The central stove became even more important during storms. Maintaining a steady fire ensured that the interior remained warm despite the harsh weather outside. Fuel supplies were monitored carefully to make sure they lasted throughout the storm. Storms could last many hours or even several days. During that time, families often remained inside their homes as much as possible. Daily routines slowed, but essential tasks continued. Animals still needed to be checked whenever conditions allowed. Snow sometimes had to be cleared from entrances or around camps. Despite the danger of these storms, Mongol families were rarely completely unprepared. Generations of experience had taught them how to recognize warning signs in the environment. Changes in wind direction, unusual cloud formations, or sudden shifts in temperature could signal that a storm was approaching. Animals themselves sometimes showed signs of unease before major weather changes. Herders who paid attention to these signs could begin preparing before the worst conditions arrived. Preparation often meant gathering animals closer to camp, strengthening shelters, and ensuring enough fuel and food were available. These early actions sometimes prevented serious losses. Another important factor in surviving extreme winters was mental resilience. Living on the steppe required patience and determination. People understood that winter would eventually end. Even the most severe storms would pass. Maintaining hope and focus during difficult moments helped families continue working through challenges. This resilience became a defining characteristic of Mongol culture. People raised in such demanding environments developed strong adaptability and endurance. These traits played a major role in the rise of the Mongol Empire under leaders like Genghis Khan. Warriors who had grown up surviving brutal winters were naturally tough and disciplined. They could endure long journeys, harsh weather, and physical hardship better than many of their opponents. But for most Mongol families, survival was not about empire or conquest. It was about protecting their animals, caring for their children, and maintaining the traditions that allowed their communities to thrive on the steppe. Winter was simply one part of that cycle. When the cold finally began to weaken and the first signs of spring appeared, life slowly shifted again. Snow melted. Grass returned to the plains. Animals grew stronger as fresh grazing became available. Newborn animals began appearing in herds. These changes marked the end of the most difficult season. But the knowledge gained during each winter never disappeared. Every storm, every migration, and every challenge added to the experience passed down to future generations. Children who watched their parents manage animals during storms or prepare camps before cold nights were quietly learning the same skills. By the time they grew older, those lessons became part of their own survival knowledge. This constant transfer of experience helped Mongol culture remain remarkably well adapted to the steppe environment. Even today, many nomadic families in Mongolia continue to use techniques that were developed centuries ago. Their homes, clothing, and lifestyle still reflect the deep connection between Mongol culture and the cold landscapes they inhabit. And that connection remains one of the most fascinating examples of human adaptation to extreme climate. But there is one final part of the story that brings everything together. Because the way the Mongols survived the coldest winters was not based on a single invention or technique. It was the result of an entire way of life built around understanding the land, animals, and seasons of the steppe. When we look back at the history of the Mongols, it becomes clear that their survival during the coldest winters was not the result of one clever invention or a single survival trick. It was something much deeper than that. It was an entire lifestyle carefully shaped by centuries of experience living on the Mongolian steppe. Every part of Mongol life worked together to create a powerful system of survival. Their homes, their clothing, their animals, their food, their traditions, and even their beliefs were all connected to the environment around them. This system allowed Mongol communities to endure winters that could easily reach temperatures far below freezing. The gyr, their portable home, was one of the most important pieces of this system. Its circular structure, thick felt insulation, and central stove created a warm and efficient shelter even in brutal weather. The design had been perfected over generations. It was strong enough to resist powerful winds, yet light enough to be dismantled and transported when families needed to move. This mobility gave the Mongols an advantage that many other societies did not have. Instead of remaining trapped in one location when conditions became dangerous, they could relocate to better grazing areas or more protected valleys. Their clothing also played a crucial role in winter survival. Garments like the deal were not only warm, but also practical. They wrapped tightly around the body, trapping heat while allowing freedom of movement. Layers of wool, leather, and fur created natural insulation that protected people from freezing winds. Boots and hats completed the system, protecting the parts of the body most vulnerable to cold. But even the best clothing would not have been enough without proper nutrition. The Mongol diet was perfectly suited for cold climates. Meat, dairy products, and animal fat provided high levels of energy. These foods helped the body maintain warmth and strength during long days of physical activity. Warm drinks such as milk tea offered hydration, comfort, and additional calories. Even the simple act of sharing hot tea inside the gyr helped maintain both physical warmth and social connection during long winter nights. Animals were at the center of this entire survival system. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and camels provided nearly everything Mongol families needed. They provided food, clothing materials, transportation, and fuel. Horses in particular were essential. Their ability to dig through snow to reach grass helped entire herds survive during winter. Their strength and endurance allowed people to travel across the frozen steppe. These animals were not simply property. They were partners in survival. The relationship between Mongol herders and their animals was based on careful observation and respect. Herders watched their animals closely, learning their behaviors and understanding their needs. This knowledge allowed them to respond quickly when weather conditions changed. But perhaps the most powerful survival tool the Mongols possessed was knowledge itself. Generations of experience living on the steppe had created a deep understanding of the natural world. People learned to read the sky, the wind, and the landscape. They recognized signs of approaching storms. They understood where snow might accumulate and where grass might still be accessible beneath the frozen ground. This knowledge allowed them to make decisions that protected both their families and their animals. Even disasters like zuds, the severe winter events that could threaten entire herds, were faced with strategies built from experience. Families moved their animals when necessary. They shared information and resources with neighbors. They relied on strong community relationships to overcome difficult seasons. This cooperation strengthened the resilience of Mongol society. Winter survival was not an individual effort. It was something communities faced together. Cultural traditions also played an important role. Storytelling, music, and shared meals helped maintain morale during long, dark winters. Stories about ancestors, heroes, and great leaders reminded people of their heritage and their strength. Among those leaders, the figure of Genghis Khan remained central to Mongol identity. His life symbolized resilience, determination, and the ability to overcome hardship. For many Mongols, these stories reinforced the belief that strength and unity could carry them through even the harshest conditions. This mindset was just as important as physical survival tools. A strong mental outlook helped people remain calm during storms, patient during difficult months, and hopeful for the return of spring. Over time, these survival skills did more than just protect Mongol communities. They helped shape one of the most remarkable civilizations in history. The same resilience that allowed Mongols to endure freezing winters also made their warriors incredibly tough and adaptable. Armies raised in such conditions could travel long distances, endure harsh environments, and operate when other forces were forced to stop. This endurance played a significant role in the rapid expansion of the Mongol Empire. Under leaders like Genghis Khan, Mongol forces crossed vast landscapes and connected regions that had rarely interacted before. Yet behind those dramatic historical events were ordinary families who had spent generations mastering the art of survival on the steppe. Their knowledge allowed them to live comfortably in a place that many outsiders considered uninhabitable. Even today, many nomadic families in Mongolia continue to live in gers, herd animals across the steppe, and follow seasonal migration patterns similar to those used by their ancestors. Modern technology has introduced some changes, but the basic principles of steppe survival remain surprisingly consistent. Mobility, preparation, respect for nature, strong community bonds, and deep knowledge of the land. These principles allowed the Mongols to do something truly remarkable. They did not simply endure one of the coldest environments inhabited by large human populations. They built a thriving culture within it. Their lives were not defined by winter as a disaster. Instead, winter became a challenge that shaped their identity, strengthened their communities, and refined their skills. The freezing winds of the steppe were not just obstacles. They were teachers. They taught patience. They taught resilience. And they taught generations of Mongols how to live in harmony with one of the most powerful forces on Earth, the cold. And that is how the Mongols survived the coldest winters without freezing.